The Long Beach Sports Arena seated just under 14,000 people, but on the evening of July 14, 1979, there were bodies pressed into every corridor, every stairwell, every standing ledge the fire marshal had failed to account for. The International Martial Arts Festival had drawn competitors and observers from 31 countries. Flags were hung above the competitors' entrance in alphabetical order. A Portuguese delegation sat 7 rows behind a Japanese delegation. A Korean Grand Master occupied a folding chair that had been placed, with quiet ceremony, at the end of the 4th row. The floor smelled of chalk and polished wood and something older than both. Something that only accumulates when men who have spent decades learning how to hurt each other agree, for one weekend, to stand in the same room. Steven Seagal was 32 years old that night. He stood 6 feet 4 inches in flat-soled training shoes. He weighed 231 pounds, and not 1 pound of that was soft. He had trained in Osaka for 15 years under masters who did not tolerate the word almost. He held a 7th degree black belt in Aikido. He had operated as a CIA-linked security consultant in Japan. He had broken bones in training sessions with men who had broken bones in other men professionally. He was not a rumor. He was not a marketing exercise. What he could do with his hands in a small space had been verified by people whose testimony cost something to give. In 44 seconds, inside a conversation that would be remembered on 5 continents, something would happen to him that no credential had prepared him for. Nobody in that arena, not the Korean Grand Master, not the Portuguese delegation, not the fire marshal who had stopped counting at capacity, knew what they were about to witness. The event had been building toward a single centerpiece exhibition for 3 days. 2 men, 1 empty floor, no contact rules, a demonstration of mastery rather than combat. The promotion materials had circulated for 6 weeks. They named one man and implied the other. They used the phrase living legend twice, and the phrase unrepeatable once. By the time the Friday evening session opened, the rumor had compounded into something close to myth. The other man was someone who had not appeared in public competition in 4 years, who trained in private on a hillside property north of Los Angeles, who had once, according to a story that could not be verified and could not be dismissed, asked a student to throw a punch at full speed and then held a lit candle between his forearm and the blow. The flame did not move. Steven Seagal did not concern himself with rumors. This was not arrogance. It was a trained discipline. He had spent 15 years learning to evaluate only what he could see, to respond only to what was physically present, to dismiss what could not be tested. It was in its way his finest quality as a martial artist. It was also, that evening, the thing that would cost him. He arrived at the arena through the competitor's entrance at 7:30. He wore a white gi, pressed at the shoulders, open at the collar. He carried his belt folded in his left hand rather than wearing it. This was not showmanship. He simply did not need the advertisement. He signed 3 autographs in the corridor without stopping his stride, nodding once at each person, his eyes already on the floor ahead. A journalist from a West Coast martial arts publication watched him enter and later wrote that Seagal moved the way a courthouse moves, with the absolute confidence of something that has never had to justify its own weight. He was given a seat in the 2nd row, stage left. The folding chair had been placed there deliberately by the event organizers, to give him sightlines to the demonstration floor. He sat with his feet flat. He did not stretch. He did not roll his neck or prepare his hands. He simply waited, with the quality of patience that belongs only to people who have never doubted the outcome of their waiting. The preliminary exhibitions ran for 40 minutes. A 12-year-old girl from Seoul performed a board-breaking sequence that left the arena briefly, genuinely quiet. A Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner submitted 3 consecutive challengers in under 4 minutes total. A blind practitioner from Kyoto demonstrated pressure point sensitivity to a standing ovation that lasted longer than anyone had planned for. Then the lights above the floor changed color, dropping from the flat institutional white of the preliminary session into something warmer and more deliberate, and the announcer's voice came over the speaker system at a volume lower than anyone expected. He said one name. The arena did not applaud. It breathed. He came from the far corridor, the one the preliminary competitors had used. And so for the first 2 seconds after the announcer spoke, no one saw him. There was only the corridor's mouth, an open rectangle of slightly darker shadow in the changed light, and then he was there. He was wearing black training trousers and a plain gray shirt with no insignia. He was smaller than most of the audience had imagined. A detail that struck observers differently depending on what they knew. Those who knew nothing were surprised. Those who knew a little were confused. Those who knew exactly who he was felt something shift in their understanding of the word small, as though the room itself had quietly adjusted its definitions. Bruce Lee was 38 years old. He had not competed publicly in 4 years. He weighed, by the estimate of 3 separate observers who would later compare notes, approximately 134 pounds. He walked to the center of the floor without looking at the audience, without acknowledging the announcer, without any gesture toward the occasion's formality. He stood still for a moment that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and felt considerably longer. And then he looked up. The recognition moved through the arena the way weather moves across flat water. Not all at once, not gradually, but in a current, row touching row, section touching section, until the whole building had registered what it was looking at. And then gone very quiet with the effort of holding that registration. Steven Seagal, in the second row, set down the bottle of water he had been holding, and did not pick it up again. He had heard the name, he had dismissed the rumors, but he had heard the name, and he had formed an opinion about what the name meant, and the opinion had been shaped by what he could not verify and had therefore, correctly by his own principles, set aside. What he had not accounted for was the quality of presence the man on the floor carried without any apparent effort, the way the room reorganized itself around him simply because he was standing in it. Seagal watched the preliminary portion of the demonstration. He watched Lee move through a sequence that covered perhaps 12 square feet of floor space and contained, by the count of a karate instructor from San Diego who timed it later, 41 distinct techniques in 22 seconds. The instructor said afterward that he had counted by feel rather than sight, because sight had not been sufficient. After the sequence, Seagal stood up. He was not invited to do so. He was not prompted. He simply stood, because sitting had become the wrong posture for what he needed to say. If you want to know what was said in the next 44 seconds, make sure you are subscribed and leave a comment below, telling us where in the world you are watching from. Because what happened in those 44 seconds, and what Bruce Lee said to Steven Seagal when it was over, a sentence that only 2 people heard, would not be repeated publicly for 23 years. Seagal spoke from the second row. His voice carried easily. It had that quality of trained resonance that belongs to men who have given commands in noisy spaces. He said that the demonstration had been impressive. He said the word impressive with a particular weight that suggested he had calibrated it carefully against words he had chosen not to use. Then he said that he had heard many stories about Bruce Lee, about his speed and his power and his philosophy, and that he had a great deal of respect for the tradition Lee represented. And then he said, Bruce Lee has never faced someone who actually wanted to hurt him. The arena went the kind of quiet that is not simply the absence of sound, but the active suppression of it. 2,000 people holding their collective response in their chests, uncertain whether to release it. He said it again, in slightly different words. He said that in his experience, speed without weight was a liability at the highest levels. He said this with the calm of a man who believed it entirely, who had tested the principle in rooms that were not configured for spectacle, who had the results. Bruce Lee did not respond immediately. He stood at the center of the floor for a period that the journalist from the West Coast publication later measured, by his watch, at 7 full seconds. He stood with his feet at shoulder width, his hands at his sides, his expression carrying the specific quality of a man who has arrived at a decision rather than approaching one. Then he said 3 words. Show me then. A fight is not 2 men demonstrating their techniques at each other. A fight is an argument about distance. And the man who controls the distance controls the argument entirely. This is not philosophy. This is geometry with consequences. Steven Seagal moved onto the floor. He was a full foot taller. He outweighed the man across from him by approximately 100 pounds. He had, by any objective measure, every structural advantage the physical world could offer. He understood this. He was not reckless. He approached with the controlled forward-weighted posture of someone who had entered these negotiations many times before, and found them conclusive. He stood 8 feet from Bruce Lee and made his first decision. He moved to close the distance. Second 1. Seagal stepped forward with his right foot and extended his left arm in the first motion of an Aikido entry, a technique that in practice had ended the movement of men considerably larger than the one in front of him. His arm extended toward the space where Bruce Lee's right shoulder occupied the air. The shoulder was not there. It had not moved backward. It had not moved sideways. It had moved at an angle that did not correspond to any of the directions Seagal's arm had anticipated, and the entry technique completed itself against nothing, against air that no longer contained what it had contained when the technique began. In the second row, the Korean Grand Master placed both hands flat on his thighs. Second 2. Seagal reset. This was itself a technical accomplishment. Most men, finding their entry dissolved at that speed, would have required a longer reset, a re-establishment of position that would take them out of the argument for half a second or more. Seagal did it in perhaps a quarter second, which was excellent. It was not sufficient. Bruce Lee had not moved more than 18 inches in total. He had not retreated. He had simply relocated the specific point in space where his body existed, 3 times in 2 seconds. Each relocation timed to the moment before Seagal's technique could address it. The journalist would later describe this as watching someone try to catch smoke with a fishing net. The tool was not wrong. The substance was simply not cooperating with being caught. Third attempt. Seagal committed. This is the technical term for it, and also the honest human term for it. He decided to stop calibrating and to trust the weight. He moved forward with his full mass behind a controlling grip aimed at the lapel. The kind of entry that in Aikido creates the leverage for any of 17 follow-on techniques. The kind of entry that is not a gamble, because the mass behind it is not a gamble. The lapel was not there. Bruce Lee was behind him, not beside him, not at an angle. Behind him, standing 2 feet to his right and slightly back, in the space that a moment ago had been outside the argument entirely. He had not stepped around, he had not ducked under. 3 separate observers, including the San Diego instructor and a stunt coordinator who had worked on 12 action films, said afterward that they could not account mechanically for how the position changed. They said this not as mysticism but as a technical confession. They had watched and they had still missed it. Seagal stood still. He did not turn immediately. He stood for perhaps 2 seconds with his back to Bruce Lee, in a position that was not vulnerable. His balance was intact, his posture was correct, but that was, in every way that mattered, conclusive. The conversation about distance had produced a verdict. Both men understood it. The stunt coordinator, sitting in the 8th row, set his clipboard down on the seat next to him without looking at it. He would later say that he did not want to be looking at paper during what came next. Bruce Lee did not strike. He was, at the moment Seagal stopped moving, in a position from which 3 separate finishing techniques were available to him, each one requiring less than a full second to complete, each one carrying enough force to end the argument at the level of physics rather than ceremony. He did not use any of them. He stepped back 1 pace. He lowered his hands, the right hand extended, palm up, fingers open, toward the man who was still facing the wrong direction. Seagal turned slowly. He looked at the hand. He looked at the face above it. The face was entirely without judgment, without the particular quality of satisfaction that accompanies a point proved at someone else's expense. It contained only an offer, the offer of the hand, and through the hand, the offer of what the hand meant. 2,000 people in the Long Beach sports arena held their breath with the specific quality of witnesses who understand that what they are seeing will not be repeated. Seagal took the hand. Bruce Lee leaned forward. He spoke 1 sentence, quietly, close enough that no microphone captured it, and no observer at 2nd row distance could read it from his lips. 1 sentence, spoken with the same economy he had used for everything else that evening. Steven Seagal would not repeat that sentence for 23 years. When he finally did, In an interview published in a Japanese martial arts journal in 2002, he said only that it was the most useful thing anyone had ever told him, and that it had taken him the better part of a decade to understand why. The journalist from the West Coast publication wrote that the room stayed quiet for 11 seconds after the handshake ended, and that in 30 years of covering events in this sport, he had never been in a room that chose silence over applause before, and had not been in one since. Seagal walked back to the second row. He sat down. He did not speak for the remainder of the evening. The story moved the way stories from that era moved. In person, in dojos, in the margins of phone calls between people who had been there and people who had not been there but knew someone who had. It did not appear in newspapers. It did not appear in the martial arts press for nearly 4 years, and when it did appear, it appeared in a form that had already begun the process of mutation that all oral history undergoes, the process by which the essential truth remains intact while the surrounding details drift toward whatever serves the telling. By 1983, the story had Seagal issuing a formal public challenge. By 1987, it had a crowd of 10,000. By 1991, a version existed in which Seagal was knocked unconscious, which was not what happened, and a competing version in which Seagal won on a technicality of Aikido theory, which was equally untrue. The Korean Grand Master, who had been in the fourth row and had placed both hands on his thighs during the second exchange, gave a single interview on the subject in 1994. He said that what he had witnessed was not a demonstration of fighting. He said it was a demonstration of the difference between a man who has studied how to control a body and a man who has studied how to control a space. He said those were not the same study, and that the confusion between them was the source of most of the suffering he had observed in 40 years of this art. The San Diego karate instructor quoted him in seminars for a decade afterward. The stunt coordinator gave up counting credentials in his film work the following year. He said later that he had been using the wrong measurement. Steven Seagal continued, he did not discuss the evening publicly for 2 decades. He trained, he worked. He became by most accounts a considerably more dangerous man in the years that followed than he had been before that July night, which was not a small thing given what he had been before. Those who trained with him in the early 1980s noted a change in his approach to distance, a new patience in his entries, a reluctance to commit that they initially mistook for hesitation, before they understood that what they were witnessing was not hesitation but calibration, the same calibration he had watched in action on a floor in Long Beach and had been thinking about, slowly and carefully, ever since. He had stood at the fork in the road that July night, and he had chosen with his hands before his mind caught up, and he had chosen correctly, and the choosing had cost him something, and given him something larger in return, which is the only exchange that is ever worth making. The story a man carries about himself and the story that survives a 44-second conversation are 2 different stories. Both of them belong to him. Only one of them is true. A credential is a record of what a man was prepared for. It cannot prepare him for what it did not anticipate. This is not the credential's failure. It is the credential's honest limit, and the honest limit of a thing is the most useful fact about it. What Bruce Lee said to Steven Seagal in those final quiet seconds, the sentence that only 2 men heard and only one repeated 23 years late, in a Japanese journal, has never been published in English. We may tell you what it was in the next episode. When we go inside the room, on a hillside property north of Los Angeles where Bruce Lee trained alone, and where the principles of what happened in Long Beach were not discovered in a moment of confrontation but built, slowly and deliberately over the preceding 11 years. Subscribe now. That story begins next week.